Is this Aches' biggest L? That's
We're
what you.
just starting.
Yeah. I mean, I'll cut it together.
I gotta regain. I wasn't expecting you to start it like. Okay.
I can
Okay.
give you
Okay.
my spiel before then, but I think you know
No.
what
No.
I'm
No.
getting
No.
at.
No. 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 Okay. Just ask me again in like 3 seconds, and we'll go from there.
Is Shotzi winning a world championship, his second, and winning champs MVP for the first time? Is this Aches' biggest L that he's taken in his career?
So that is in reference to, the whole superstar, is Shotzi a superstar debate that we've had multiple times this offseason and whatnot. I will say, Aches was pretty spot on by quote unquote predicting that OpTic would win champs after going on a massive S&D losing streak similar to his EG team that won champs in 2018. But jokes aside, yeah, I think this firmly puts any uh, debate about is Shotzi a superstar to bed. Not only is he an all-star this year, he's a two-time champs winner and a champs MVP now. Um, I think Shotzi is a superstar, and that puts that debate to rest. The additional note is there is always going to be, now if Shotzi has an off event next year or any event in the future, Aches could come back for the content and try to have that debate again. But just briefly looking ahead now to Black Ops 6, there's the Omni movement that's supposed to be a part of Black Ops 6 in terms of like being able to do different things with like sliding and aiming and whatnot while moving. And we know how much of a movement demon Shotzi's been since coming over to COD. And there was initially talks when this Omni movement was first like leaked or announced with initial Black Ops 6 details. I know there was a clip of like Scrap saying like, yeah, we're gonna GA that. But in a recent COD podcast, they said that it's not gonna be like an optional setting or anything. It's gonna be a part of the game. And with just the way Shotzi's been able to manipulate movement and all that stuff over these years, uh, we could potentially be set up for Shotzi to have an even bigger year coming up if he's able, whatever this Omni movement is and how he's able to take advantage of it and whatnot. It's a potentially interesting thing to think about in terms of the whole, is Shotzi a superstar? Yeah, he is, and this might not even be his ceiling if whatever is coming down the road unlocks something extra in him. We might not even have seen the best Shotzi yet, which is definitely got to be scary for the other teams in the league.
I want to move past OpTic now. Congratulations to OpTic Texas on winning the World Championship. Congratulations to the Green Wall. But I do want to talk about the team that they beat in the grand finals, the New York Subliners. For transparency, I put a bunch of questions in our notes about some of the top questions, the leading questions that I had for each of the top 5 teams. Which I'm sorry, I did not include Seattle, LAG, or Miami. I did not put any questions for them because I didn't. But the top 5 teams in my mind: OpTic, NYSL, Toronto, LAT, and FaZe. Those teams I had questions about as we move forward. Of course, we've answered quite a bit of the questions surrounding OpTic. But for New York, a team that won the World Championship last year, they came, as close as you can by losing in pretty convincing fashion in the grand finals. They get back to the grand finals of champs this year. Where do they go from here? Where do the Subliners go? Do they make a roster change? Because it obviously seems like, why would you do that? Well, they made a roster change after they won a
Yeah.
world championship. So I think it's a valid question. Do you think they should make a roster change this offseason?
Do I think they should? No. Did I think they should last year? No. And they did anyway. So that's definitely a very interesting conversation to be had. Just because they were willing to do it after winning a championship, and obviously I think there was like contract negotiation situation there with Priesta. It wasn't like, yeah, we don't want Priesta. It was something, most likely on the monetary side that led to that. But nonetheless, if they were willing to make a move after winning champs, they in theory, should be willing to make a move after getting second in champs. The biggest thing for me, I know Benjay Nissim of the Flank did like a free agent tracker doc, which isn't official or anything like that, and he has down that Hydra and Skies would be under team option for next year, where Sib and Kismet would be under contract. I had seen stuff just like on the timeline and whatnot of people like debating is Hydra a free agent and whatnot. Um, so I think regardless of the whole making moves or whatnot for New York, priority one for them this offseason should be to lock down Hydra if he isn't already.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it wasn't too long ago we were having that conversation of him like getting a mega deal from New York, but obviously I don't know the terms of the deal, how long it was, and all that stuff. So it could just be people yapping on the timeline and whatnot, and um, in any case, if Hydra is under contract, that's great. I think he has certainly proved himself, and even at champs, he just played out of his mind in some scenarios, and um, he's really solidified himself as one of the stars of this league. So that's where you start for New York. You got to lock him up if he isn't already locked up, and you build around him from there. If he continues to want to team with these same players, then you go at it. But if the guys decide to go in a different direction, like I said, they were willing to make a change after winning champs. I wouldn't be surprised if they're willing to here. I just don't know what the change would necessarily be.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing for these top four teams is we're going to get to, Toronto and Atlanta too, is like if you make a change, you're in theory, unless you're like swapping a guy on your team for a player on another top four team, you're potentially helping those teams that are quote unquote below you catch up. Because like let's just say for an extreme example here, which I don't think this would happen, but just to set the scene a little bit, if Hydra was to go to LA Thieves, or let's go even more crazy, let's just say Hydra goes to LAG, like that just completely shifts the power dynamic in the entire league. Like LAG immediately becomes like a much better team than they were considered, although they had their top three run and yada yada all that this year. Very extreme example there, but you know what I'm saying in the sense of I think that's something all of these top teams have to consider, as opposed to in past years where it was kind of just like, yeah, we're just going to try to make the best team we can. Now it's sort of like, are we improving some of these other teams by making a change ourselves, and we're just going to stay like in the same top four status as we already were. But if you think you're making a change to get better, then I guess you might not worry about how it impacts other teams and whatnot. It's definitely a fine line that some of these teams they're going to be asking themselves some heartfelt questions too about what they want to do next year, and if they want to run it back or make changes. But it's going to be interesting. But for New York, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they stick it out. If they do decide to make a change, I don't really know who they would make a change for. And I would say priority one just has to be making sure Hydra is in a New York Subliners uniform for as long as humanly possible.
The thing with New York is they might not be looking to make a change immediately, but I think everyone should be looking at Atlanta FaZe this offseason and wondering, what are you guys doing? And then if something changes there, that is likely the first domino to fall. And these other teams who maybe weren't looking to make a change might be, well, let's see here. Like, we have a few more options, a few different options than we thought were available to us at the beginning of the offseason. But that's where my head is at, where New York might not be thinking, okay, like, let's replace Skies or let's replace Sib. But if, let's say, for the sake of argument, Celium comes on the market, I think that's a conversation, right? That's a conversation with Sender and D-Real and the New York front office saying like, hey, should we be like poking around Cell? Should we try to see if E and Hydra, which would be like, one of the most talented duos of all time, like that has to be a conversation in my mind.
And I think, to play devil's advocate too, the one thing I was seeing on the timeline, which obviously this has absolutely no factual bearing as far as I know, it's just, some people yapping on the timeline and speculating, and not even speculating, more like theory crafting or very wishful thinking, saying that Atlanta FaZe should go after Hydra and have a team where Sid moves to the flex, or Simp moves to the flex, and have it be Cell, Simp, Abizi, and Hydra, which that would be nuts. Uh, and I don't know how it happens. I don't think it does happen just because it would be a lot of money, I feel like.
Mm-hmm.
But that's like one of those scenarios I'm thinking where it's like, then in that scenario, yes, Atlanta seemingly is getting really, really good. They're also letting an all-star from this year, Andraza, go on the free market and then potentially make another team even better. But in that scenario, you got a chance to get a guy like Hydra. I don't think you pass it up. But that's I would be shocked if that actually is something that happens. But I've been surprised before.
I didn't really have any other super pressing questions with New York because they're in a position where they're not too low. They didn't perform. They performed well. Like I should say that the only team that they lost to here was OpTic, and they won Major 4. Hydra was, up for MVP. He was an all-star. They have a really good team. I don't have that many questions. Is there a question or something that you're looking at with New York moving forward?
Not necessarily a question, but it's just I think it's worth saying is that this is a New York team that was definitely facing some difficulties or inconsistencies this year up until this past month. They win Major 4 and get second at Champs. If that doesn't happen, this conversation about should they or should they not make a roster change is completely different in my eyes.
Yeah.
Or we're probably, sitting here like, yeah, they got to do something and, try and switch something up. If let's just say they got like 2 fourth place finishes at Major 4 and Champs, like, yeah, I think the conversation is completely different. But they hit some kind of different form at the end of the season here, and that's what we've been preaching for months now on this pod. Is you want to be playing your best COD at the end of the season. That's what they were doing. They won a championship. This is back-to-back years. They've won the last regular season LAN event, and then they were in the finals of Champs the last 2 years. Obviously, they won once and lost another, but that's where you want to be. And it's 3/4 of that roster doing it back-to-back years. How much of that do you want to change up? And you can make the argument that you win an event with 4 guys, you change one guy on the team, you also win an event and get the finals of Champs. Like, does changing one person really put you back in that position you were before, or does it just speak more volume to that core 3 they have that have done it for 2 years in a row? So yeah, I don't really have any other questions for New York. I just think it is worth mentioning there that the conversation could look and sound different if it wasn't for how they've played over, the last 2 events of the season.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And if you just think about the totality of their season, they should, in theory, be at least considering a roster change, right? They were, for 75% of this year, a very distant 4th place after winning a world championship. They finished top 12 at the first major. So if you reversed their season, basically, if you said that they are really hot coming out of the gates, which you might expect of a world champion, they're really hot out of the gates, they get second at the first major, say they win the second major, and then they kind of like start to slide off as you get to the end of the season, and then you get a really disappointing final event, then of course everyone's like, well, that's obviously a roster change. But flip it, and we have the same results in reality, but it's the timing of it and the hope that comes with the performance that they had over the past 6 weeks. I don't know where they go. I tend to think that they won't make a change, but I also think that it could very much depend on what happens with the other top 4 teams. If Toronto, if New York, obviously, if Toronto, FaZe, or OpTic, for whatever reason, decide to make a change, that changes the dynamics for New York. And we could be talking about another Subliners offseason roster change. The next one that I want to talk about is Toronto. This is one where I think they obviously started off very, very strong. They were the best team in the game after Major 1. That was undisputed. They looked so far and away better than the rest of the league at that point. The rest of the season was not as kind, and they were not bad. I think they were, throughout the regular season, probably the second most consistent team in the league. But they come up short again. They get third at Champs last year. They get second at Champs, get brutalized in the grand finals by New York. Scrappy is, again, one of the best players in the league, an MVP candidate, and definitely like a rising star, one of like the faces of the CDL now. Where does Toronto go from here? I think this is an offseason of change, most likely, for Toronto, but they did the same thing last offseason, out with Hixie and with Envoy, and Envoy was probably their most disappointing player this season.
I don't know how much you remember from last offseason, and I might be remembering this not completely, but I feel like I have a decent enough memory to just know there were at least rumblings and rumors that Toronto was going to make massive moves last year when it was Hixie, Kleenex, and Insight. I know there was conversations, not necessarily conversation between teams, I should say that. There were rumors around Kleenex and Insight splitting up, and then there were rumors at one point, I feel like, where it was going to be Scrappy and then 3 Challengers players around him. I don't know how, serious any of that was or anything, but I feel like it's safe to say there are at least conversations around massive changes to Toronto before they eventually landed on deciding to spend the money to get a player like Envoy once that LAT roster split up. So, yeah, I think Toronto is going to be one of those teams that's at least willing to explore making some moves. I just don't know what the moves is going to be. Is it, again, sort of similar to like New York, you change their Toronto was in Champs Grand Finals last year. They make a change this year. They win an event and they get third, which is just one place lower than they were last year at the end of Champs. But like you said, they were the second most consistent team this year behind Atlanta. I don't think you can really argue that. Does a one-person change really make that much of a difference? How many, like, I feel like there's a lot of questions around what they could do and what would actually improve the team. So I'm not sure what direction they're going to go in. I feel like, I think one thing I had in my mind before OpTic obviously won the event, I feel like if Toronto and OpTic both didn't do well at Champs this year, we could have seen a world, and this is before the formal stuff came into view too. But I think Scrappy is destined to be on OpTic eventually. He just feels like that's the type of guy like Hex and them are gonna want. He's he gets eyeballs on him when he's talking his trash and doing his thing, and he's a really good player at the end of the day too. I wouldn't have been surprised if we saw like a Scrappy and Dashy swap. Dashy getting to go play for Toronto, his hometown, if things weren't working out for OpTic, and then Scrap goes to OpTic to seemingly be an upgrade in some sense, even though they were both all-stars. Now I don't think that's happening, but I think for Toronto's sake, they got a really good guy there in Scrappy. He was a part of their challenger system, that fed into the main team now. And similar to what I was saying with Hydra, priority 1 for them seemingly should be to lock down Scrappy and build around him. But I just don't know what the answers are around him, how many changes they have to make. Obviously, and the pod listeners know how much I think of Kleenex. He certainly, this weekend, I feel like he had some inconsistent performances, and obviously that could have played a role in Toronto not getting where they wanted to be again in the grand finals of Champs. But end of the day, yeah, it's another solid season from Toronto, right? We're saying second overall in the standings. They got a major championship, had some other decent placings as well. Just didn't get the big one at the end of the day. And what's it going to take for them to get over that hump?
That is a big question around each of FaZe, Toronto, and New York is if you do make a move, what is the move? What can you do with a team that is essentially all 4 of these teams are all-star teams in a way. I think almost all of them had multiple all-stars on their teams. So I think New York was the only
Yeah.
team that of those top four that didn't, and they had Hydra, who's arguably the MVP. He actually had the highest share of the all-star vote, so he was like the top all-star, at least in the SMGs. So what can you actually do? And that brings me to FaZe next. We'll skip over LAT for just a moment and talk about FaZe because they tie into this. Obviously, they get knocked out by Toronto at Champs, that's kind of the deal. That was what we were hoping for in the end, was that matchup of Atlanta versus Toronto, Scrappy versus Draza. The CDL production crew was even being messy and putting their girlfriends on the screen, which I thought was a bold choice.
I couldn't believe they actually did that.
But it begs the question now. Atlanta, they finish top 6, which I believe is their worst champs finish in the CDL era.
Has to be.
Because they made the grand finals of like all but 2 of the CDL era grand finals, and I think they got maybe 3rd last year. So they've pretty much been as close as you, except this year. They run into New York in the first or in the second round in the upper bracket, and then they lose to Toronto. They lose to 2 of the top 4 teams, however you want to put it. They lose to 2 really, really good teams, great teams. But it begs the question of, is this the end of an era for this team, for this trio of Celium, of Simp, and aBeZy? These 3 guys have been together for the entirety of the CDL since the Call of Duty League formed in late 2019, began in early 2020. These guys have been the core of the Atlanta FaZe roster. And at one point, they were the most dominant team. 2021, they ran through the competition, but they have not been that team for the last few years. They did win Major 2. It looked like maybe they had broken out of that mini drought that they were going through, but they ran into some of the same issues that they had been running into late in tournaments. They can't seem to get over the hump consistently. Maybe that's too high of a bar. Maybe it is so competitive, especially at the top of the CDL, that maybe we shouldn't expect a team like Atlanta FaZe or any of these other teams to actually consistently win championships like this. But I don't know. It feels like the end. It feels like something has to change. Do you think it is the end? Do you think FaZe should make a move and possibly break up the trio of aBeZy, Simp, and Celium?
Do I think they should? No. Do I think this is potentially the closest, or just, the point where a conversation has to be had or will be had? Yes. I think, historically we've talked about them being in championships and losing those events, and I feel like there's not much of a conversation to be had around that in terms of like, oh my god, we just lost a championship, we have to make a roster change, right? But again, similar to Toronto, this is FaZe were the best team in the regular season again. They obviously didn't win multiple championships, but they were in multiple finals, and then they just have their worst showing at Champs, which is obviously unfortunate in terms of when it happens and how it happens and whatnot. So I think there's going to be some tough conversations for Atlanta. I don't know if they do make a move though, and I don't know if splitting up the trio is the answer. But then again, at the same time saying that, I don't know if just going for replacing Draza with somebody is the answer as well. So I don't know what Atlanta does, but I think there are at the very least going to be some conversations there around what they want to do and what direction they want to go in, if they want to run it back with these guys and try again, because you also got to consider, like, yes, OpTic won champs, but this was like Atlanta's best season against OpTic in like 2 or 3 years, right? Since like Cold War, I feel like. So like that has to be taken, talk about like, matchups for like these top 4 teams. It felt like, Atlanta had OpTic's number for a good portion of the year, but Toronto had Atlanta's number, and then obviously OpTic has New York's number as of this most recent event. But New York was beating Toronto. They beat them in the losers finals here, so it's kind of like like a circle sort of thing where it's never ending in terms of who's beating who among those top teams that we're considering. But yeah, I think it's definitely not where I imagined Atlanta was going to be at the end of this season. I definitely didn't think it was a conversation we would be having about whether they have to make a move or if they will. But I think it's going to be considered, and I just don't know what the answer at the end of the day is. I think, if you can make a mega move, like something like the ridiculous getting Hydra, I don't know how well Scrap and Cell would really play together, but in a world can get someone like Scrappy, is that an answer? I don't know. But I think there are going to be some conversations had in the Atlanta camp, and they're going to have to try and figure out if they want to make a move, and if they do, what that move is going to look like. But definitely also worth mentioning, just that was having Atlanta versus Toronto in the losers bracket round 2 at CoD Champs was not on my bingo card for this event. And then having Toronto just absolutely 3-0 chokeslam them basically was not something I foresaw as well, let alone the CDL putting up Scrap and Draza's girlfriends on the big screen in the stadium to further the drama and beef between those two and their families and whatnot. So that was definitely interesting. But overall for Atlanta, yeah, I think this might be the most difficult offseason for them in terms of just looking at and I feel like it's tough because it's not it's weird to say it's not like a bad placing, because it's not what they expect to get top 6. It's but how much do you differ getting top 6 at champs versus getting last place in a major, right? Like what is that difference there? And obviously champs is the bigger one, so it is going to carry more weight. But does a 6th place finish at champs just nullify everything else they did in the regular season and getting in producing I think they ended up with the most wins in a CDL regular season this year. They had the most CDL points of any team, so it's just a weird spot to be in, I feel like.
And that's the position that they've been in for most of the CDL. This is the 5th CDL season. They have been the top seed heading into champs all 5 times. They have been the top regular season team every single season in the CDL's history, yet they've only won one world championship, and that was in 2021. And they made roster changes, I think, every season except after Cold War, which obviously, why would you make a roster change after that season, after how dominant you were? But that's... I think there's always kind of, especially when it ends on a bad note, and it did end on a bad note. They finished top 6. I think you also have to think, okay, like, were we really the 6th best team in the CDL? Probably not, but we ran up against the 2nd and 3rd best teams. Like, we ran up against teams that really match up with us well. I think New York, Atlanta is a better matchup with New York than they are Toronto.